Fantastic. So hopefully we are now live and all of the participants in the room can see and hear this message. But thank you everybody for joining us, both of our esteemed panelists and panel participants and our audience members from all over the world. And a special shout out to our uh, people joining us from the region of Central Asia who are joining us particularly late. My name is Wesley Alexander Hill. I am the lead analyst and international program manager for the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. I will be today's moderator for this event. This event is co-hosted by the International Tax and Investment Center's Energy Growth and Security Program. We have been doing work on Central Asia on a myriad of topics, anything you could possibly think of, geoeconomic, geopolitical, elections, taxes, etc., in the Central Asia region since 1993. And we are co-hosting this event with the Oxford Society for Central Asia Affairs, which is one of the most well-renowned regionally focused think tanks on Central Asia in the Washington, D.C. area. And these two robust institutions are joined by a more robust panel of four excellent panelists who I will briefly introduce before allowing them to let their accolades speak for themselves. So first, we are joined by Dr. Edward Lemon. He is the president of the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs, and he is also a professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. We are joined also by Laura Lockman, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Energy Resources at the United States Department of State. We are also joined by His Excellency Roman Vassilenko, who is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Kazakhstan, and Dr. Ariel Cohen, Managing Director of the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. And he is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So we have convened this rather august panel because we are discussing both a broader topic and a region emblematic of this topic, and that is an emerging multipolarity in the world and diplomacy. Central Asia sits at the center of the world's global island. It has been an area of contest between the Chinese, the Mongols, Arab empires, the Russians, any political entity in Eurasia that you can think of has had some sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic interest in Central Asia. This has resulted in a lot of diplomatic maneuvering and diplomatic acumen on part of local actors in the region that is going to be extremely vital, not just to understand unfolding multipolarity, but also how multipolarity is both practiced and adapted to. At the same time, we are confronting a new multipolar moment in the international system. Multipolarity seems to be more and more an inevitability with multiple poles of power in the form of the United States, China, Russia, and perhaps a consolidated European Union and maybe even India emerging as different centers of polar power with different relationships with one another. And the one area that these all converge is in Central Asia. And it is also worth noting that the one area which has already experienced practical multipolarity in the last 30 years is also Central Asia due to its borders with China, Russia, and then Iran, Afghanistan, and then beyond that, India to the south. So I think I have sufficiently teased the topic enough for our esteemed panelists to go into more detail. But first, we'll start with Professor Lemon. So, Professor Lemon, please feel free to introduce the topic and begin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wesley. Thank you to ITIC for co-hosting this event with the Oxford Society. We're tremendously important topic. We're very excited to be discussing this issue today. And I think the first point I wanted to make is building off what Wesley's just said in so far as Central Asia has always been, in its independent history, a multipolar region. When many other parts of the world were experiencing the unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Central Asia, of course, was grappling with its newly independent status and having to develop foreign policies independent of the Soviet Union for the first time. And of course, by virtue of the region's geography, we've seen it it borders Iran, China, Russia. Of course, it's always had multipolar. It's always existed in a multipolar world. And multi-vectorism as an idea of balancing relations between the different countries and power centers of the world was something that was first coined in Kazakhstan by President Nazarbayev in the early 1990s to find a way to navigate this newly found independent status in this multipolar world. The idea is that a country within the international system can have positive relations with multiple different centers of power within the international system. So you can be partners with Russia, Iran, China, the United States all at the same time without that being problematic. And so the goal is to be able to use the agency that these individual states have to balance relations between different centers of power without having to choose one side. I think a big question for us today in this panel, I'm interested to hear the opinions of the other panelists, is as we move towards an era of heightening great power competition in the United States with the Trump administration and the Biden administration, both labeling great power competition as being the operating principle of US foreign policy and the focal point of our national defense and national security strategies. Where does that place Central Asia in an era of increasing geopolitical rivalries between China, Russia, and the United States in particular? How can Central Asia continue to pursue this multi-vector foreign policy with the United States and other centers of power asking the Central Asian republics, in some cases, to choose sides over issues such as Ukraine or the situation in Xinjiang? To what extent is this multi-vectorism sustainable? And I think there are a number of reasons to think that the agency of the Central Asian states may in fact increase as a result of this rising geopolitical rivalry, given the presence of critical minerals in Central Asia, given Central Asia's position between China and the states of Europe, given Europe's desire to transition away from gas and oil. And so we see the region, in fact, increasing its agency within the international system. And I think we see a region that's increasingly developing ties amongst the states. So historically, Central Asia was one of the least integrated regions of the world, but in recent years, we've seen trade doubling. We've seen annual meetings between Central Asian leaders, and I think it'll be crucial for Central Asia's ability to maintain its multi-vector foreign policies for greater coordination amongst the leaders of the 5 different countries that make up Central Asia. So with that, I'll hand back to Wesley to continue the panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lemon, for that excellent introduction to the region and touching on so many important issues. I'd now like to turn to a recent practitioner of diplomacy, well, a current practitioner of diplomacy, actually, Deputy Assistant Secretary Laura Lockman. So please, we'd love to hear your thoughts both about Dr. Lemon's introduction, but also what's going on in the region, what U.S. policy is, et cetera.
Great. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the invitation to be here with all of you. And thank you to Wesley Hill, and a particular greeting to Deputy Foreign Minister of Kazakhstan, Vassilenko. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So to talk a little bit about Eurasian multi-vector diplomacy from the energy perspective, I would echo some of what Dr. Lemon just said in terms of the centrality of this region, historically and particularly at this moment. And in fact, just this past week, I spoke at another forum on Eurasian and Central Asian energy security. So clearly, there's increased interest in this region and these issues on the international stage. And really at the center of this discussion, as we see it, is Central Asia's increasing role as a regional and a global energy producer. And I think, globally, the imperative of climate action is forcing nations to re-examine their dependence on fossil fuels, as well as decarbonize their industrial sectors as we face more and more extreme weather events. And this past year has shown us many examples of this. Then we are all also grappling with a set of challenges that are essentially the ramifications of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, which has led to a drastic reshuffling of global energy markets. And we have all witnessed Moscow's systematic and continued targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So essentially, we've learned in spades the risks of allowing one nation to monopolize energy supplies. And it's made clear to everyone that Russia can never be viewed as a reliable supplier of energy. And again, just driving home that we shouldn't rely on any one supplier for any critical product. It's a truism that all of our country's national security depends on our energy security. And today we have an opportunity to look at these twin challenges of climate action and energy security in a coherent way. And these goals are so often framed as a trade-off, but in fact, we very much see them as complementary and entwined. So across the Caspian and throughout Central Asia, energy diversification is integral to the region meeting its domestic as well as its global energy demands. And diversification is and will continue to be a part of what we're talking about today, Central Asian multi-vector diplomacy. So, for example, for a multi-vector approach to energy security to continue, Central Asia must look to improve gas connectivity so as not to rely solely on Russia for any shortfalls in the region's winter supply, as we're seeing now. And again, this goes to Dr. Lemon's point about the interconnectivity and increasing trade in the region. So significant work remains to connect the countries in Central Asia one with the other. And regional gas interconnectors, not only in Central Asia, but in all regions of the world, contribute to energy security by improving the efficiency of the assets that are already deployed, making better use of existing supplies, and then becoming more attractive for investment as well. And this is certainly true of electricity interconnections, which not only bring flexibility for trade, but also for use of various power sources, including renewables and the new technologies. Another area ripe for regional cooperation is addressing the aging fossil fuel extraction infrastructure and poor emissions controls. So these vulnerabilities lead to disproportionately high methane emissions, which is really a source of significant wasted energy resources, as well as major climate impacts. It's estimated that about 12 billion cubic meters of natural gas is wasted every year in the Central Asian region due to vented, leaked, and flared methane, which is ironically roughly the same amount of gas exported from the Caspian region to Europe last year. So we're working with our Central Asian partners, accelerating projects, improving operations to prevent these methane emissions as really a low-cost, kind of no regrets energy security and climate imperative. But ultimately, the most effective way to increase the energy security of Central Asia and the world is through the clean energy transition. So shifting from fossil fuels, which often have a reliance on, again, large external sources, to renewables, which could be more locally produced, will also contribute to the sustainability of economies and to action on the climate front. And in that regard, a final thought, building stable, secure, and resilient supply chains for the minerals that are needed for the energy transition, so for all the clean energy technologies, is a critical part of our engagement with the region. Central Asia in particular has sizable potential for critical minerals development. And with sound governance and experienced private sector partners, the region could become a very important contributor to advancing the global clean energy transition. We've started work, again, with specific players in the region to accelerate cooperation on the issues around critical minerals and creating the environment that would attract the investment as well as, kind of figuring out what is there, doing surveys and figuring out what is there. But all of these issues, I would say, are part of our emphasis on Central Asia, which you saw in the inaugural C5+1 meeting that the Secretary of State had last fall at the UNGA with the region. And in that, we created a critical minerals dialogue, which will start next month, actually. And that's a direct outcome of it. So again, we are very interested in further strengthening our partnership with the region. We've been deeply and uniquely engaged for more than 3 decades and stand ready to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Lockman, for that amazing set of information. I would now like to turn to His Excellency Minister Roman Vassilenko, and he can give us some viewpoints from the region.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and distinguished panelists, thanks both to ITIC and Oxford Society for hosting this wonderful event and for your efforts to raise awareness about Central Asia. Indeed, throughout the 3 decades of our independence, Kazakhstan has maintained a multi-vector foreign policy, engaging with nations across regions, building bridges and fostering understanding bilaterally, regionally, and globally. Considering our history and geographic location, it becomes evident that this approach is deeply rooted in our national identity. Indeed, the multi-ethnic and diverse composition of our nation has played a major role in shaping our multi-vector foreign policy. As the 9th largest country in the world, situated in the heart of Eurasia, Kazakhstan has always been right in the middle, connecting cultures, religions, and civilizations. And probably this is the very answer for the nature of our multi-vector approach. It is about being in peace with oneself, with our neighbors, and helping to find the middle ground to all who need it. As many of you would agree, the last few years were very eventful for the Kazakh foreign policy and for the world, of course, with many international experts and political observers noting Kazakhstan's diplomatic engagements both at home and overseas. And given the global tensions, some experts, including our members of the panel, wonder at our ability to maintain a positive dialogue with any country in the world, be it in Asia, Europe, America, or Africa. But isn't that what diplomacy is for? And I should say that we are lucky to have a leadership that knows what diplomacy truly means. And it is truly about providing friendly and peaceful environment both at home and abroad. Indeed, President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, one of the pioneers of the multi-vector foreign policy, has played an instrumental role in skillfully crafting and implementing this approach, reflecting Kazakhstan's nuanced and balanced diplomatic strategy aimed at maintaining constructive, mutually respectful, and mutually beneficial ties with all major powers while asserting our own national interests. Thanks to our multi-vector approach, Kazakhstan is now a respected member of the global community. And not only do we not have enemies, we do not have tense relations with any nation on earth. Touch wood. Certainly, the approach has evolved to suit changes in geopolitical reality. The model of multi-vector diplomacy today is different from the initial one that was designed for a simpler, mostly bipolar world. It has now become a multi-layered and multi-dimensional system that helps us navigate the complexities of the contemporary multipolar system. This policy is clearly laid out in our foreign policy concept, listing our top priorities in developing relations with the countries of Central Asia, Russia, China, the United States, the European Union, and other states. The model has helped us promote peace and security in Europe and Asia. We are proud to be the first post-Soviet country to have achieved a clearly defined and internationally recognized borders, a significant accomplishment in any part of the world. Kazakhstan successfully chaired the OSCE, for example, hosted the first and so far the only OSCE summit this century that adopted the Astana Declaration. We also apply our approach within SICA, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, to advance similar goals in Asia. In fact, SICA has evolved since 1992, when it was first proposed by Kazakhstan. It now includes 28 states, and it operates based on consensus, which is a principle fostering trust and multilateralism. And nowadays, SICA is progressing towards transformation into a full-fledged international organization. Our diplomatic efforts have also enabled us to establish a presence on the American continent, with Kazakhstan holding the permanent observer status with the Organization of American States since 1996. As noted, cooperation with the United States is one of the pillars of Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy. Last year, Astana and Washington have celebrated the 5th anniversary of the enhanced strategic partnership between our two countries. In fact, Kazakhstan is the only country in the region with the ESP status, and we cherish our long-standing partnership, tested and proved by time. The C5+1 Leaders Summit in September 2023, which Secretary Lohman just mentioned, became another important milestone, and we continue working closely to implement commitments outlined in the New York Declaration. But consider also our nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation efforts and cooperation with the United States. I remember well our good cooperation with the American partners during my time in Washington, in our embassy, and I know that this cooperation continues on a very good footing. But dear friends, the international relations are not only about global powers today. A healthy and sustainable way to connect includes cooperation with multiple actors at various levels. Middle powers, such as Kazakhstan, are helping shape regional and global agendas while contributing to problem solving. For our part, we are ready to cooperate in the spirit of inclusiveness and goodwill. This aligns with our vision for regional growth in Eurasia, fostering win-win relationships where domestic and external ambitions intertwine. Indeed, by working together, we can overcome challenges and build a secure, sustainable, and prosperous global society. We understand the importance of Central Asia, which I mentioned already, to achieve these goals. In this context, the consultative meetings of Central Asian heads of state is a forum that promotes unity and addresses the region's development needs. Intra-regional cooperation is expanding. As Central Asia gains its own voice and numerous opportunities for trade, investment, and innovation, the C5+ format and its further development is going to be crucial. Kazakhstan has identified the diversification of transport corridors passing through the country as a top priority. The Russian-Ukrainian war and the Western sanctions on Russia have created a new reality in international transit from Asia to Europe. Transit along the northern corridor, which passes through Russia, has fallen by 40%, prompting us to look for alternative routes. Kazakhstan is actively developing the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, better known as the Middle Corridor. We also support efforts to expand transport routes between Central and South Asia and develop the North-South and East-West Trans-Eurasian corridors. We look forward to creating new and modernizing existing multimodal transport corridors and logistics centers. And to address these issues of everybody's concern, a top-level Kazakh delegation has just visited Brussels to attend the Investors Forum that, of course, you have probably heard of, coming home with deals worth 1.5 billion euros in European commitments. Overall, the European vector is one of Kazakhstan's top foreign policy priorities, and the effective and comprehensive dialogue we have built in all areas enables us to address any and all issues in a constructive manner. Active cooperation between Astana and Brussels and other European capitals has produced many tangible results, including the signing of the Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. In recent years, our political interaction, both bilaterally and in the Central Asia plus EU format, has evolved into a new level, and we are now moving towards the first formal summit between Central Asia and the European Union later this year. Our multi-vector foreign policy is not just about engaging with the world. It is also about enriching our own society and empowering our citizens. And by embracing cultural diversity, promoting education and innovation, and fostering people-to-people exchanges, we seek to find common ground and cooperation that transcend borders and boundaries. Kazakhstan values its multi-religious society as a diplomatic asset for promoting dialogue and cooperation among diverse nations. Initiatives such as the Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions reinforce mutual respect, tolerance, and global coexistence. President Tokayev's recent meeting with Pope Francis in the Vatican highlights our shared commitment to interfaith dialogue. In summary, Kazakhstan's multi-vector policy is a model, a successful model, we believe, with strategic balancing, economic diversification, commitment to peace, and a pragmatic approach. We will be happy if it can serve as an inspiration for other friendly nations navigating complex geopolitical challenges, embracing diversity, cooperation, and sustainable development. Thank you. I'll be happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much for giving us such an in-depth perspective from the region, including forthcoming initiatives and ongoing initiatives. I would now like to turn to Dr. Ariel Cohen to give us our final opening remarks before we move into the question and answer section. So please, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you very much. We are International Tax and Investment Center. Our program is Energy, Growth, and Security Program, and we work a lot on Central Asia, energy, transportation, and our recent report with Wesley Alexander Hill and W. Alejandro Sanchez on rare earth minerals. The report is available on ITIC website /resources. That's the top paper on our website in the resources section. But generally speaking, we have been working on Central Asia as long as the program exists, since 2018, and I was working on it since the 1990s. And since the 90s, I'm watching in awe this development of diplomatic power, diplomatic muscle of all 5 Central Asian countries, but especially Kazakhstan and now increasingly Uzbekistan. This means that the region becomes an agent of international relations. It started with the creation of foreign service. And I think Roman was there probably more or less from the beginning. And I remember the current President Tokayev as a foreign minister and then as prime minister standing at the beginning of Kazakh diplomatic service. The topics that Kazakhstan and other countries dealt with included nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation. Kazakhstan plays a great role. And in fact, just yesterday, there was an important event at Carnegie Endowment looking at the history of Kazakhstan's nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. The regional cooperation was always at the top of Kazakhstan's agenda. Relations with all 5 members, the creation of the nuclear-free zone, which, by the way, that treaty is not ratified by the United States until this day. I don't understand why. Furthermore, promotion of foreign investment, initially in the oil and gas sector, oil in Kazakhstan, gas in Turkmenistan, and then opening their borders. I think, Roman, you probably know better than me, what, over 80 countries have either visa-free or an easy visa regime to visit Kazakhstan for tourism and business. And now Uzbekistan is also following your example. Furthermore, Kazakhstan is successfully dealing with a number of educational, human rights, and religious issues. And this is necessary for our colleagues on the Hill when they finally look at the PNTR status for Kazakhstan, what we used to call the most favored nation status, and lifted. This is a relic from the Soviet era. The reason for the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which I am old enough to remember, from 1974 to facilitate free immigration for Soviet Jews. Well, the Soviet Union is no longer here. The ex-Soviet Jews now are Uzbek, Bukhara, Kazakh, Russian, Ukrainian, etc. Jews who can travel wherever they want. And to have Jackson-Vanik on the books is just ridiculous. Furthermore, the challenges of nuclear testing and the environmental disaster in the Aral Sea created environmental issues that Central Asian diplomats need to deal with. And now moving forward, the colleagues already mentioned that the world is changing. Russia and China are asserting themselves, and Kazakhstan, for example, has a very, very long border with both Russia and China. Other Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan have a border with China as well. And also, let's not forget, there's a problematic child in the region, that's Afghanistan. And the countries are forced to deal with the Taliban regime in Kabul. You don't choose your geography. So these are the challenges on the table, and also other challenges, including more investment-friendly regimes, training. There's no world-renowned diplomatic academy in Central Asia. Roman, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is necessary, in my view, to train the future diplomats. What else? C5+1, we already mentioned an historic meeting with President Biden. Also, the C5 in Berlin with Chancellor Scholz, the visit of President Macron, the visit of President Putin, the visit to Xi'an in China, meeting with Xi Jinping. I'm sure the diplomats are very busy and probably are going to get even busier. But the paramount concern is, in this turbulent environment, how Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the three other Central Asian countries are preserving the sovereignty and becoming, enhancing and increasing their agency, how they're dealing with the same rare earth investment regimes, how they're dealing with carbon emissions, how they're dealing with the middle corridor. So these are, as you see, the confluence of economic, trade, and investment topics, as well as hard security topics. And I'm sure with wise and experienced leaders such as President Tokayev, who is a consummate diplomat, speaks, what, 5 languages, I think, fluently. Chinese, Russian, I think Arabic, Kazakh, of course, and I'm missing one more. Roman, help me out. Okay.
French.
Okay.
French.
And
no Arabic.
No Arabic? Okay. And practitioners like Roman Vassilenko, who is carrying on his shoulders the EU portfolio and the international information portfolio. I am sure that the diplomats in Central Asia will be up to the task in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Dr. Cohen for that excellent introduction, and also to all of our panelists for their various introductions and opening remarks. So, for logistical reasons, to inform the audience, we are going to go into question and answer section, but we will first ask Secretary Lockman several questions because she has time constraints. So it's not an inquisition. We promise it's not an ambush. After these questions are asked, we will try to distribute them more evenly. But to our audience watching, please feel free to ask questions in the question and answer section at the bottom of your Zoom meeting, or if you are watching on the Oxus Society website, there is a little chat bar that you can use there. So our first question is for Secretary Lockman. So, what changes do you foresee for American diplomatic best practices going forward, in general, in the age of multipolarity? And do you think that there are some lessons that American diplomats or diplomatic initiatives can draw from the recent experiences of Central Asia?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Wesley. So I'm going to be echoing some of the previous speakers in my answer on this. And I think the deputy minister stated it very well when he said that Kazakhstan is undertaking cooperation with multiple actors at various levels. I mean, that is exactly what we all need to be doing. We are all grappling with not just local issues or regional issues, but global issues. And that requires reaching across borders, across regions, to a much greater extent than we have at any point in history. And we are seeing, again, as has been laid out, we're seeing the Central Asian governments, although they have been doing this, as also mentioned, for literally centuries, increasing their efforts, particularly on the trade front and diplomatic front, transportation fronts, to create this multi-vector relationships. And we, from our perspective, the Secretary Blinken and President Biden have been very intentional on this topic, understanding that the United States needs to adapt to this multipolar world in the same way that we just talked about Central Asia reacting. And so forming alliances across many different, borders and barriers to deal with specific issues where we all have shared interests and hopefully in many cases shared values. And so we have established many new multilateral dialogues and relationships forming on various topics between the United States and its partner nations every year. So we're weaving these alliances and partnerships in really innovative and mutually reinforcing ways across issues and continents at this point. And you've seen that in our relations with Central Asia. Clearly, we understand that Central Asian nations have long had and will continue to have relationships with Russia and the PRC and other neighbors. But that doesn't preclude us cooperating as well. It's beneficial to all of us. And so you've seen the high-level dialogues we've undertaken with the Central Asian governments over the last year, including each country's annual bilateral meetings. And I think, as mentioned, Kazakhstan recently saw theirs promoted to an enhanced strategic partnership dialogue. And Uzbekistan, we have a strategic partnership dialogue. Turkmenistan, high-level working group on methane emission abatement, and also the Kazakh strategic energy dialogue that we are just launching. So with these kinds of initiatives, you can see that we have been making that real intentional effort to increase those linkages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have another question that is actually perfectly dovetails off of your answer, Secretary Lockman, and it is from the Oxus website. It's, what form will the critical minerals dialogue take? Will there be a role for civil society, either American or Central Asian, or are there any plans further down the supply chain, and what is the overall impact of extraction and processing. And I promise, even though we just did a report on this, we did not plan to to ambush the secretary with rare earth elements questions.
No, that's a critical, no pun intended, topic. Critical minerals and critical materials. We've talked about the need to diversify our sources of energy, and so we need these new technologies that are literally fueled by the critical minerals. So shoring up the supply chains is is a priority for us and for many others. And again, we do not want to relive the story where we have great dependence on just one or a handful of suppliers of critical materials. And so we are very interested in working with Central Asia and other regions as well to, again, identify what is available, geologically speaking, in various regions to rapidly, scale up production of critical minerals and do that in a sustainable way. And this is really the key point for the United States, where we think we are differentiated in our approach, because we're trying to put communities first and focus on local economic benefits, as well as elevation of environmental, social, and governance standards. So where you might be able to get easier financing or lower standards with certain partners, ours is a different approach. It's trying to make sure that the local economies and communities do benefit, and from development of the supply chain as well, not just the extraction of the materials themselves, but their processing and development. And so this is going to be a big part of the C5+1 critical minerals dialogue, which again will be starting in a couple of weeks here. We also have a mineral security partnership that we launched over a year ago now, and United States and 14 different partners are working to provide a value proposition for minerals rich countries, and again along the lines of what I outlined previously with sustainable economic growth for these countries. And we've seen a great amount of interest from Central Asia in the MSP. So we'll be working together on that as well. Over.
So thank you very much for that answer. Continuing the trend of keeping Secretary Lockman in the hot seat, we've had several questions all come in that basically ask very, very similarly on different energy sectors in Central Asia. So in the interest of time, I was wondering if you could briefly enumerate what American investments or American initiatives are going on in Central Asian energy, but subdivided by type of energy resource. So we've had people ask specifically about wind, solar, and hydrogen. So if you could say just a little bit about those in detail, that would be very much appreciated.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Yeah, we have cooperation bilaterally with the countries of Central Asia. We also have a U.S. Agency for International Development regional program, which covers some of these issues as well. Wind and solar, there are significant resources. Obviously, hydro already exists in the region, and that's one of the, the low emissions options that the region already benefits from. And so developing more on the wind, solar, and you mentioned hydrogen. I think, again, globally, we're trying to figure out the hydrogen piece right now. Figuring out not only the technical side of it and how to be most efficient with the electrolyzers and different technologies, but the commercial component of it as well, the economic equation of it, and then the transportation of hydrogen. So we are, again, globally, we're grappling with this. We're hoping that on a lot of these technologies, what we're doing in the United States under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of our other pieces of legislation, which are putting enormous amounts of investment into some of these sectors. We're hoping that that will, move the innovation forward and create more at scale production on these fronts, which will increase the availability and reduce the cost to countries in Central Asia and elsewhere of eventual adoption. So again, through our USAID program and bilaterally, we are working with the Central Asian countries on looking at the regulatory and legal environments for the development of renewables and alternate technologies, with the goal to increase the investment perspectives in those sectors. We're looking at, how you do, how you organize your systems in order to increase the percentages of renewables in your electricity grids. What kind of grid improvements are necessary? We're looking at how you do, reducing the emissions profile of some of the production of energy writ large within that value chain. So there's a lot of different aspects that we're looking at, and it's exciting. I mean, this is really a huge area for cooperation with the region. We're ready to dive in. We've got our technical experts traveling out there actually fairly frequently at this point, and then these dialogues will only reinforce that. So we are excited. Thank you.
So I now have a question, well, actually several questions concerning the Aral Sea and adjoining regions, especially Kazakhstan, also for Secretary Lockman. So for the benefit of the audience who is listening, for those of you that may be briefly unaware, Kazakhstan is the northwestern part of Uzbekistan. So several questions amalgamated together, but the first one is that it seems that there is a lot of Chinese investment in the region, and several locals, based on what they're saying in the questions, would like more American investment, especially in Kazakhstan. Is there a way for more American investment to flow into the region? And do you think that there's anything the United States government could do to facilitate this investment, whether it's in energy, they specifically mentioned several energy projects, or just in more general economic activity?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, and this is one of our raison d'etres in the State Department, is to try to facilitate, those connections on the trade side with U.S. companies and opportunities overseas. And we have many other U.S. government agencies working on that mission as well, including our, the financing agencies, which of course include our Export Credit Agency, the EXIM, and the Development Finance Corporation, et cetera. And so our embassies within each of these countries is looking with open eyes at what opportunities exist for these types of collaborations and what opportunities exist for American investment and trade in those environments, and trying to do matchmaking essentially. And we invite anyone who has some specific ideas to approach us with those, and we are happy to move forward in trying to make the right connections. And I think that American companies are looking, if you look at the critical mineral space, for example, they're looking all over the world at this point for opportunities, because we can't produce everything that is required in the United States. This is a quintessential multipolar issue. And so our companies are very interested in those types of cooperation. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Secretary Lockman, for being in the hot seat and answering our questions in rapid fire. I promise it wasn't an ambush or anything. So we have a lot of questions for the rest of the panel, so I'm going to open it up more broadly now to the rest of the panel, but I hope that you can stay with us as long as possible. So this next question is for His Excellency Roman Vassilenko. So several people in the audience are asking if you can say more about local regional integration, the C5 without the +1, so to speak, and especially how this relates to diplomacy and also the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Advancement, PGII. So please, we would love to hear you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I think that it would be fair to say that in Central Asia over the past 5-6 years, there is a growing recognition of the fact that we are stronger together and we have more agency, and that's a word many of our panelists have used before. If we work together, if we coordinate better our approaches, because for one thing, we have common challenges, and that's first and foremost managing dwindling water resources against the backdrop of rapidly growing populations. We also have a common challenge in dealing with Afghanistan, which is also an ascendant economic power in the region, with the Taliban seeking to develop the economy they now run, including by building, for example, the Kosh-Tepa Canal to use water from the Amudarya River. So there is a growing dynamics of positive cooperation within Central Asia. There are, of course, problems such as the unresolved border issues between countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And thankfully, we see more and more indications that these two countries now work better together and are delimiting this border, which is a source of contention and a source of military conflict in the past several years. But this year, Kazakhstan is chairing the C5 format. And later this year, we will be hosting the summit, another summit. And the very fact that these summits are a regular thing is a positive thing, as the
Minister Vassilenko. It appears that we have had a technical difficulty with His Excellency. So while we are waiting for him to rejoin or the connection to reestablish itself, hopefully sooner rather than later, we will continue with the discussion. So I'm sure he will rejoin us shortly. It would not be a Zoom webinar without some sort of technical difficulty or hiccup. It's basically tradition. So I would now like to field some more questions, especially for Dr. Cohen and Dr. Lemon. So both of you, especially Dr. Cohen, engage a lot with Eastern Europe and Ukraine, which is often tied in geopolitically with Central Asian actions. So several questions from the audience have all revolved around how does multivectoralism, multipolarity, and the war in Ukraine impact the Central Asian political space? Terribly sorry. I believe His Excellency is reconnected. Mr. Vassilenko, can you hear us?
Sorry about that. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. Please,
yeah,
please continue.
We need better connection. Speaking of connectivity, we need an underwater Trans-Caspian photovoltaic, whatever cable that will give us a better internet here. But I was saying that it's a much stronger political cooperation, which on the five-sided level, but that is also reflected in the bilateral formats, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have now much stronger relations. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan now work together very well. Kazakhstan and Tajikistan are about to advance our relations to an allied relationship. So, and other bilateral ties are also improving. So overall, the trend is very positive, and we're quite optimistic, but we all need to continue to work together to achieve what we all set out to achieve. In terms of PGII, as you know, in Brussels, just over a few days ago, an investors forum took place with the EU coming forward with 10 billion euros in commitment to the development of the Trans-Caspian international transportation route. I know that the American delegation also was there from Washington, and our colleagues were there, and I hope that they had chance to discuss how not only Global Gateway initiative put forward by the EU, but also PGII initiative put forward by G7 could also be directed towards this very, very important project, which is going to be a project of the next 5 years, if not a decade. And whatever is going to be done now will have an impact on how close the EU, Europe, and the West will be to Central Asia and vice versa in the years and decades to come.
Thank you very much, Minister Vassilenko, for first of all quickly rejoining us, but also answering that question. So now I would like to field the same question that I had answered while Minister Vassilenko was disconnected, back to Dr. Lemon and Dr. Cohen. So, how does the ongoing war in Ukraine reshape the geopolitical dynamics of Central Asia, Eurasia, especially with an eye towards multipolarity and multivectorism?
Well, the main challenge, of course, is that wars cause diplomatic polarization, and the topic of our discussion is diplomacy. So Russia is trying to convince countries of Central Asia, but not only, also the Caucasus and elsewhere, in a typical sort of Russian fashion, to quote, I think it was Maxim Gorky, the writer, "Кто не с нами, тот против нас." Those who are not with us are against us. But at the same time, I must say that Russia understands that these countries need to make a living. Therefore, if Kazakhstan continues to export oil through the Black Sea and the Russian port of Novorossiysk, and the pipeline that goes from Kazakhstan through the Russian territory, that pipeline is still working. There were some hiccups, there were some interruptions. Russia was signaling by closing the pipeline for World War II mine removal and whatnot. At the same time, we are sort of yanking on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to be very meticulous in imposition of the sanctions. And Kazakhstan did a pretty good job. They have a list of banned military related products and technologies. And my understanding is that there's relatively few complaints. Of course, there will be always bad apples. Companies either set up by the Russian migrants into Kazakhstan or by others who are trying to make a buck. For example, Armenia for decades was one of the locations where the Iran sanctions were circumvented. So these things happen. In World War II, Switzerland and Sweden and Turkey were notorious locations for circumvention of the blockade of Germany, Italy, and their allies. So nothing new here, but I think the multi-vector diplomacy, the skill of Kazakh diplomacy, and the reasonableness of the countries that are engaging with Central Asian countries all point that so far we are looking at the environment where these countries can still survive, develop, and attract investment. In that respect, the Trans-Caspian transportation, the middle corridor, having more ships on the Caspian, and potentially underwater fiber optic cables, and eventually pipelines. There's, as long as I'm in this business, which is over 30 years, there's a talk of an interconnector for gas under the Caspian between Turkmenistan and the TAP-TANAP, Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, the Azeri-driven gas system. And I'm not even talking about the oil pipeline that would help Kazakhstan tremendously to connect across the Caspian to the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan. I think it's not happening anytime soon, as long as Iran and Russia are objecting to that. but there are opportunities. It's a balancing act, and I think, from what I see in Washington, our government, State Department, NSC, the Pentagon, we all understand the predicament our Central Asian friends and colleagues are in.
I think just building off what Dr. Cohen has said, I think for those reasons related to sanctions, related to the transition of the European states away from Russian oil and gas, related to the growing importance of Central Asia. Russia is one of the few regions in the world where it can avoid international isolation, where Putin can still travel, despite the ICJ ruling against him, where Russia can continue to try and project its power. I think so. The region's grown more important for Russia. Migrants from Central Asia have grown more important for the Russian economy with the mobilization of so many, and the out-migration of so many young males in particular to the war effort or to other parts of the world. So I think the region's grown more important. And I think we saw the evidence of that in 2023, right, where we saw the first heads of state level meeting with President Biden at the UN General Assembly. We saw the first heads of state level meeting of the China plus Central Asia format that was developed during the pandemic in May. We saw the first meeting between the Central Asian presidents and Chancellor Scholz in Germany. We saw the first meeting between the GCC and the Central Asian presidents, right? So all of these different formats indicated that the region's becoming more important. And I think importantly within regional cooperation, I think it was important that Aliyev from Azerbaijan attended the president's, the summit of the Central Asian presidents in Dushanbe in the fall of 2023. So pointing to Azerbaijan and this idea of a middle corridor becoming increasingly important for the region. So I think Central Asia, as a result of the war in Ukraine, has become more important on the global stage, and its agencies of the countries, as I said initially, has increased.
Thank you very much for that answer, Dr. Lemon. So now that Secretary Lockman has departed, the question should be a little more evenly distributed without it being quite so inquisitorial. So I have another question for His Excellency Minister Vassilenko. And this is, what diplomatic lessons do you think Kazakhstan and Central Asia can bequeath to American diplomats and other foreign policy practitioners, especially given its recent experiences with multipolarity?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Frankly speaking, I think it is quite inappropriate for me to share any advice or lessons to the American diplomats. We are in different leagues, and I'm a deputy foreign minister of Kazakhstan, of course. But as I said in my remarks, I do hope that countries that are in a similar situation like ours see our experience for whatever it is, and learn some lessons from us, not from us, but from our experience, and use this experience in their own foreign policy without having to commit the mistakes that we have committed in the past. And although I mean, I need to say that they were very few, far between, as they say, but still, I'm sure there were mistakes, and it's better if you learn from others than from your own mistakes. We are indeed in a very tough situation. We need to continue to balance this relationship, as many of the panelists have just said. But what I would say is that there is no choice for us. There is no other way for us but to continue to pursue this multi-vector foreign policy, to continue to develop relations with Russia, despite everything that's going on internationally, with China and with the West. And that's the policies I must say I see other countries in Central Asia pursuing exactly in the same fashion. So we are rowing in the same direction. And I think it would be great if the West rose towards Central Asia, shall we say.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Lemon, we have a couple of questions in chat that are directed at you that all hint at some sort of the same thing, and that is, what do you foresee from the outside looking in from a more structural perspective? What do you think are the big trends driving the evolution of diplomacy in Central Asia? And these trends can either be international or domestic to the region.
Yes, I think we picked up on many of them. We've discussed Ukraine in detail. We've discussed this green energy transition and the growing importance of Central Asia in terms of critical minerals, and also the way in which the region, as Minister Vassilenko said, will have to reckon with growing water scarcity, the effects of climate change that we're already seeing affecting the region, both within each country, but of course it's a transnational issue that needs to be addressed collectively. I think the other major development is the continued rise and role of China in the region. We've seen China emerge as one of the leading external players in the region, not only in terms of as an economic investor and as a trade partner, but also even in security, and increasingly playing a role within coordinating the politics of the region. So I think that's another major trend that we're seeing within the region. Of course, the other major unknown question is what's going to happen in Afghanistan, another issue that we've touched upon, to what extent, and we've already seen the Central Asian states developing ties. In the end of last year, of course, the Kazakh government removing the Taliban from its list of terrorist organizations, the Uzbek government positioning itself as a conduit for aid to the region, and obviously Kazakhstan doing the same. So I think that's another role that the region can play as a diplomatic focal point for Afghanistan. So I think these are some of the big trends that we're seeing across the region that will affect diplomacy, coupled with that other internal trend that's been very positive over the past 6 to 7 years, which is this growing regional cooperation and the extent to which the Central Asian leaders can cooperate not only to solve problems within the region, but also to coordinate over relations with external powers as a means to bolster that multilateralism. But it's certainly a time of great change and flux in the region, and those are the things that I think will be shaping things in the years to come.
Thank you very much. So I would also like to follow up on some of these trends you mentioned specifically, because people in the audience have asked more specific versions of the questions or the trends that you have alluded to. So the first one, and I would ask this to the entire panel, whoever wants to chime in, is about the Aral Sea and the diplomatic aspect of the Aral Sea specifically. So several panelists have alluded to the disparate situation in the Aral Sea, that the Aral Sea was in a very dire condition. It had many problems. It was drying up, but the Kazakh side seems to be taking remediation and help refilling the Aral Sea much more seriously than the Uzbek side. And even today, if you go to the Aral Sea and you look at the difference between the two sides, where the shorelines and wetlands, etc., you do see a marked difference between the two borders. So I think this poses a challenge in both the water scarcity that Dr. Lemon said, but also regional integration as a whole. So I'd like to open this up. What lessons or obstacles do you think that the Aral Sea bequeaths, and what can be done about this very important issue?
This for Edward?
It is an open question to the entire panel. Whoever wants to jump in can, but perhaps you would like to start, Dr. Cohen.
Well, thank you. As we're concerned here with diplomacy, I think both diplomatic, economic, environmental agreements, the frameworks for cooperation. For example, if there is an investment from, let's say, the World Bank or from UNDP, UN organization, that are trying to alleviate and ameliorate the tragic situation, which, by the way, for the younger of our listeners and viewers, was caused, among other things, by predatory practices of the Soviet period, when they took water from Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers and dug canals that were not up to spec even for that time. For example, the canals were not coated. So a lot of water that went through the canal just seeped through into the ground. And the canals were there to irrigate the cotton production. So Uzbekistan is moving away from cotton production. Hopefully, they are either not using as much water or using it for other things like vegetable growth, vegetable production. But regardless, the neglect in the Soviet period of the RLC and the lack of sufficient water supply is what caused it in the first place. There were also horrible other things, such as using the Возрождение Island for Soviet biological warfare program. And then when the sea dried up, the island became connected to the coast. And animals could have wandered to the island and get infected. So you need the framework agreement between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Roman, please chime in whether such an agreement exists. Probably does. Maybe you need to expand it. And then based on that agreement and based on the long-term program of putting, if they can, more water into the RLC, cleaning up biological and chemical pollution, and figuring out what can be done for the people who live there, what can be done to diminish the salt that is being spread by the wind and destroys the environment. Work on that with primarily international donors, but possibly with some other budgetary sources in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to make things better. As to specific agreements, I just don't have that knowledge, and I hope Dr. Lemon and Deputy Minister Vassilenko can enlighten us about what are the diplomatic and cooperative framework agreements in existence right now with regards to the Aral.
Shall I?
Yes, please, please chime in.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this very, very pertinent question. And it is pertinent because, of course, the problem has been in existence for decades, but also pertinent because as of January 1 this year, Kazakhstan has assumed the 3-year chairmanship in IFES, International Fund for the Salvation of the RLC. And that's actually the only organization in the region that exists, then brings together all 5 Central Asian states of the former Soviet Union. And this 3-year chairmanship we're going to use to indeed reinvigorate common efforts to, well, to save the RLC. And the reason why the northern part of the RLC is in a better shape than the southern part of the RLC is because the northern part is being fed by Sir Darya River, and there was indeed a project with the World Bank that Kazakhstan has implemented to build a dam separating this northern part of the sea from the desert, of which became the southern part of the sea. And our very distinguished and experienced diplomat Ashat Orazbay has now joined the IFES as the executive director. So we hope, and we pin great hopes on the success of that mission. Elsewhere, Kazakhstan and France are now working together to organize the One Water Summit in New York during the UN General Assembly. And this is in continuation of the One Planet Summit that President Macron was promoting earlier, but now this will be a joint Kazakh-French initiative, and it will be in New York during UNGA. So that will be another event where international attention will be focused on water problems globally, not just in the RLC and in Central Asia, but globally, and where we will seek to galvanize global commitments to the solution of these water problems. Secondly, Kazakhstan has put forward an initiative to convene the Regional Climate Summit in Kazakhstan in 2026 under the UN auspices. And that too is going to be a big event and an important event, again, for highlighting the challenges, the worsening situation, frankly speaking, with the water supplies in Central Asia, and the bigger than elsewhere impact of the climate change. The temperatures in Central Asia are rising twice as fast as they are globally because of the climate change, and we can feel it in the very warm Astana now, despite the capital of Kazakhstan being one of the world's coldest. Now it's not very cold outside at all. And I would say that in terms of the legal frameworks for cooperation, I should have added to the IFAS the fact that there is a convention for non-navigable use of transboundary rivers. And it's a convention that brings together about 100 countries, if I'm not mistaken. And in Central Asia, only Uzbekistan is a member, and Kazakhstan is on the way of ratifying that and becoming a member. So that convention, once ratified by us, will too create a legal framework for an additional level of cooperation with Uzbekistan, and we hope, of course, other countries in Central Asia join. Is we are working with our neighbors. We want to establish what is known as the Water and Energy Consortium, because that's the gist of the problem, that there are upstream countries and downstream countries, and they need water in different seasons of the year and for different purposes. The upstream countries need them for energy production in the winter, and the downstream countries such as Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan need the water in the summer for irrigation. So we are advocating the establishment of this consortium, and hopefully our neighbors in the region will come around this idea. And most importantly is the engagement of outside actors. Dr. Cohen mentioned the fact that the canals were not coated, and in fact, just a few days ago, our government reviewed the water situation in the country, frankly stating that thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of waterways need to be renovated, updated, preserved, and or newly built. And that's just in Kazakhstan, but you can imagine that the situation is very much similar in other countries in Central Asia. So not only do we need to do it ourselves, but we need to do it with the outside help, not just in terms of financing, but in terms of technologies. And that's where the EU, the US, and the UN can really play an important role.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for answering these questions. I have a two-part question directed at Edward Lemon from the audience, but it is also open to anybody that would like to answer it. So the first part is, how far do you think U.S. policy is underfunded or in Central Asia? Do you think that there could be more concrete engagement or concrete advances? And the second part is, and this is, I will open this also to Dr. Cohen, is that it seems that there is a lot of positive rhetoric on U.S. policy towards Central Asia, but comparatively little action, especially when compared with other regions. What diplomatic initiatives do you think the U.S. could undertake to rectify these deficiencies? So first, I'll turn to Dr. Lemon to answer the first part of the question.
Yeah, I think the two questions are linked, and I would say initially, of course, the region is not the largest priority for the United States, and neither does the United States have as much leverage in the region as certain other external countries that we've already mentioned, Russia and China in particular. So I think that's been true, and US interest in the region has, of course, waxed and waned, and it increased with the invasion of Afghanistan, the operation in Afghanistan, starting in the end of 2001, and then it slowly declined over the past few years, obviously with the closure of the bases in the region, decrease in military assistance to the region. But the United States remains the largest investor in Kazakhstan. And so, of course, there's particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have been singled out as the two countries that are of greatest interest to the United States. I think, there are a number of interesting and promising areas for further development of cooperation in the education sector, for example, of the number of initiatives by US universities to open up campuses in different countries of Central Asia to develop, US-style education on topics STEM, different social sciences, and I think that's one particularly promising area of cooperation. I think we've already mentioned some of the promising areas in the energy sector, where of course that's one of the reasons why US companies have been leading investors in Kazakhstan, of course, has been in the oil and gas industry, but transitioning now towards greater investments, where we are lagging behind China as an external investor in the green energy sector of the region is an promising area for further development. I think continued assistance to civil society in the region, particularly giving them the tools and the resources to monitor and hold governments accountable as they are moving towards reform processes, opening up a new Kazakhstan or a new Uzbekistan. I think giving civil society a role and supporting civil society to have a role in those processes is certainly something that the United States can continue to do. But I think ultimately, we have to be sober in our analysis and realize that the Central Asia, whilst its importance for America may be increasing for the reasons we've mentioned, it will not be as great a priority as European security, as obviously the situation in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think we need to realize that the US should play to its strengths in the region and recognize that its leverage overall is relatively limited when compared to some other external powers.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Dr. Cohen to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lemon, Professor Lemon, shall I say. In 2005, I edited a book called Eurasia in Balance. And one of the things I said in that book, that it's up to America to decide whether Central Asia is a bridge too far. And this was only 4 years after our engagement in Afghanistan. And I think the majority of our co-authors thought that US has a limited attention span, to which I reply, if you are a global power, you should be able to walk and chew gum and be engaged in an area that for over 120 years, the leading lights of global geostrategic studies were saying repeatedly that he who controls the heart of, he who controls Eastern Europe controls the heart of Eurasia, he who controls Eurasia controls the global island, and he who controls the global island controls the world. For many years, many of our colleagues thought that this is an exaggeration, this is too simplistic. The division line between the ocean-going nations, UK, US, the Netherlands, Japan, Australia on the one hand, and the land-based powers, Russia, China, Germany, on the other hand, is an artificial division. But I would say that today, when we're looking at crucial resources, energy, rare earth, when we don't want to cede critical territory to hegemony of one of the aspiring anti-status quo powers, we need to be engaged in Central Asia. And we, for example, should not have a situation that we had, I believe, in the Trump administration, that in our foreign policy doctrine, there was no mention of Central Asia as a separate subsection of the doctrine. We did have it mentioned, I believe, in our national security doctrine, but it was primarily through the prism of our engagement in Afghanistan. As I keep repeating ad nauseum in all my writings, Central Asia should be examined and engaged with on its merits and not as a secondary priority because of Afghanistan, nuclear weapons, what else, energy, etc. This is 70 plus, maybe by now 80 million people and growing. These are uniquely hybrid, secular, essentially secular states that control historical and Muslim societies. These countries are multi-ethnic, multi-denominational, as Rahman mentioned. There's a lot to be learned from Central Asian models. Learned in terms of the rights of women, in terms of education, in terms of technological development. Just think for a second, 120 plus years ago, the percentage of literate people in Kazakhstan was what, Roman? Maybe 5%, right? Before the communist revolution in Russia. The percentages of factory workers that the Bolsheviks were scrambling to get to put in the ranks of the Communist Party were in single digits. These societies were nomadic, and women's rights were out of the window. I was in Bukhara and Samarkand in 21, and we hired Dan Witt, the president of ITIC, and myself. We hired a local guy, the Tajik guy, in Samarkand, a terrific guy. He went with us to Bukhara. The level of backwardness of treatment of women, the lack of Western-style education, the lack of industrialization was mind-boggling. And these societies, because people are inherently smart, made a huge leap towards the 21st century. They covered a historic development then it took hundreds and hundreds of years in other parts of the world. So this is something to be said about Central Asian development model. And US actually should be interested, in my view, in promoting this model into theocratic dictatorships that we see elsewhere in the region and beyond, because these radical theocracies, militant theocracies, breed terrorism, as we just recently saw in October in Gaza, as we see with the Houthis and elsewhere in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. So we are approaching the end of our time today. So I'll only have time for one more short question, but I would also like to take this time to thank everybody for the deluge of questions. We were truly buried under them and we had to sort through them. So I'm very sorry if we weren't able to answer your questions in whole or even in part. But my final question is addressed first to Edward Lemon and then Dr. Cohen. So very briefly, if you could have the West or the US specifically do one diplomatic thing to improve relations with Central Asia, what would it be?
Well, I think in short, having a sitting president visit the region, it's one of the few parts of the world, few regions that have not seen a sitting president visit the US. Biden was invited at the meeting at the UN General Assembly. I'm not sure he will visit the region, given it's an election year. But I think that symbolic act of demonstrating the importance of the region to the United States would go a long way.
And Dr. Cohen, yourself?
Yeah, I think passing PNTR before such a visit. So I have a twofer here. And I also want Roman to say the final word. If you have your choice on what Kazakhstan would do or what we, the United States, would do with Kazakhstan and the region, what would that be?
No. When Mr. Hill was asking the question, I thought he was making it very easy, but Professor Lemon stole my answer. Indeed, in 30 years plus, no sitting US president visited the region. That would be a great show of commitment, interest, and support. And PNTR status, that would be great. Repealing Jackson-Vanik, of course, it's related to PNTR. That would be fantastic. But overall, I think we should view this relationship as a two-way street. So it's there are things that Kazakhstan and the region can give to the United States. Rare earth metals is one such thing, and access to Central Asia, help with Afghanistan. I think it would be a huge mistake if the United States again loses sight of Afghanistan as it did in the early 90s. We know all what happened on 9/11. And I think the hand is outstretched from the region to the United States, to the West, and this hand needs to be shaken in return.
Shaken, not
Thank you
stirred.
very much, Minister Vassilenko. I don't think any of the other panelists could have said it better themselves, and I don't think we could have picked a better note to end the topic, the summit on. So I would like again to thank everybody for joining us, and I would also like to thank our partner institution, the Oxus Society for Central Asia Affairs, for co-hosting this with the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. We hold regular events like these. We encourage you, all of the audience members, to follow us on social media, both institutions, where we are active and we promote ourselves and our events. And you can find various reports on the region, engaging with a variety of topics at iticnet.org and oxussociety.com. So thank you all very much again for joining us. We appreciate all the questions and we appreciate our esteemed panelists. And I hope you all, wherever you're joining us from, have a great day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.